In this video, we'll go over JavaScript callbacks, promises, and async await. Thanks for checking out this video. If you're just starting or even thinking about starting a career in web development, you're in the right place. I upload new videos every week. Hit subscribe and the bell to get notified. So let's first understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous operations in JavaScript execute one at a time. This means no matter how long the current operation takes, subsequent processes won't start until the previous is completed. Asynchronous operations run at the same time as other synchronous operations, and then it completes at some point in the future. So a great example of an async operation is an API call. It may take a few seconds for the data to be returned, and we wouldn't want our website or application to freeze while it's waiting on the data. Operations in JavaScript are traditionally synchronous, and they execute one at a time from the top to the bottom. So here's an example. Here we're logging the process of making breakfast. So we have our coffee, toast, and eggs. So I'm going to hit save, and here we see it's logged coffee, toast, and eggs in that order. So it actually takes a bit longer to make coffee, so let's tweak this a little bit. We're going to wrap this in a set timeout. And we'll set that to 3 seconds or 3,000 milliseconds. And let's take this coffee and put it in here. So this will demonstrate it taking a little bit longer for us to make the coffee. So now let me save this and watch the console log. Toast and eggs, pretty much immediate. And then after 3 seconds, we have our coffee. So why did this happen? Well, the setTimeout function makes the operation asynchronous by deferring to the remaining code. The entire operation doesn't pause for the 3 seconds. It continues and then it comes back to the coffee when the timer is up. Now, one important thing to keep in mind before we go any further is that JavaScript functions are first-class objects. And that means that they have the ability to be assigned to variables and to be treated as a value. They can also have other functions within them, and they can return functions to be called later. So now that we have those concepts out of the way, let's start talking about callback functions. So when a function accepts another function as an argument, this argument is known as a callback function. And callbacks are a fundamental part of the functional programming concept, and you can find them in most JavaScript code, such as this setTimeout. So this function here within setTimeout, this is actually a callback. Another example of this is map. So let's get rid of this, and we're going to create a variable and call it names. And this is just going to be an array, and we'll say John, Mary, and Bob. Okay, and then we'll create another constant, and we will name it greet. And this is going to be equal to names.map. So we're going to use the map function. And here we'll pull out a name. We'll use an arrow function. If you're not familiar with arrow functions, I have a video on that. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to check that out. And then we'll use a template literal and we'll say hello and then the name. So in this example, we use the map method, and this iterates through the array list, and the method accepts a callback. So this function here is our callback. Okay, so now let's log greet, console log greet. And we'll see that it returns an array that's been altered, and it has added hello in front of every name. So callback functions can be named or anonymous functions. So far we've only used anonymous callback functions. So let's look at a named callback function. So we'll get rid of this and let's create a function here. And we're going to name it greeting. And we will pass it a name. And then we will just log a template literal again, hello, and the name. Okay, so we have to call the function. So we'll just say greeting and we'll say John. All right, let's save that. And there we have hello John. So this function is considered a named function. It's named greeting. And we can actually rewrite this. We could turn it into an arrow function by assigning it to a variable. So greeting equals, and then we have our name argument and our arrow, and then we're just logging, so we just need one line here, and we'll say console log template literal hello name. Okay, so this one line is equal to these 3 lines here. So let me comment that out, and I'm just going to add an exclamation mark there so we can see it in the console, and let's save. Now we have hello John exclamation mark. So now we have this function, it's a named function, and we can use it as a callback in another function. So let's get rid of this, and we'll create a constant here of user info, and that's going to equal first name, last name, callback. And our arrow function, within this we'll create a constant of full name, and that's going to equal a template literal of first name and last name. And then we have to call the callback, so we'll call back and we'll pass in the full name. So this function simply combines the first and last name, and then it uses our callback. So in order to call this, we will use user info, and then we'll pass it a name, so we'll say John Doe, and then we'll pass our callback function, which is greeting. All right, so let's see what this does. Now it says hello John Doe. So notice the usage of the callback here. We're not using parentheses to define it as a function. We're passing it as an argument, and so we're not actually calling it here. We're just passing it to the other function. And this function, the user info function, is actually calling it. So the callback function would never actually run unless it's called within the containing function. Now, so multiple functions can be created independently and used as callbacks. And these create a multi-level function, and when you have too many of these nested functions, the code becomes impossible to read. And this is known as callback hell. Let's take a look at an example here. Okay, I'm not going to type all of this out. I'm just going to paste it in here. And so we'll try to go through this. It's painful to even look at. So we see we have a do something function, and this is passed a function with the result. And then within that function, we have another function that does something else with the result. And then it is passed another function with a new result. And then we have a third thing that does something with the new result. And then it passes a final result to another function that console logs got the final result plus the final result. And then after that, we have to start closing, and we have to add our failure callbacks for each one. So you can see how confusing it is to pass each function as callbacks. Callback functions are useful for short asynchronous operations. So when you're working with large sets of functions, the callback method is not considered to be the best practice. And because of this, promises were introduced to simplify things. So a promise is exactly what it sounds like. It's a promise to do something if something else is true. And if it's not true, then it won't. So a promise is used to handle the asynchronous result of an operation. With promises, we can defer execution of a code block until an async request is completed. This way, other operations can keep running without interruption. A lot of modern JavaScript libraries use promises, so it's important to understand how they work. Now, promises can have 3 states: pending, fulfilled, and rejected. So let's look at how to create a promise. So we'll start with a variable, and we'll name it promise. You can name it whatever you want. We'll make it equal to new promise. And it has to have a capital P there. And within a promise, we always have 2 callbacks. We'll have a resolve and a reject. We'll put our arrow here. And then here's where we can do stuff. Okay, so let's turn this into something that will work. So I'm going to add another constant here, of has meeting. We're going to make that equal to false. And we'll rename this constant to meeting. And so this is going to be a new promise, and it's going to check to see if has meeting is false. So if not has meeting, or if has meeting is false, then we're going to create a constant, and we'll name this meeting details, and we'll make this equal to an object, and the object is going to have the meeting details. We'll say the name is marketing meeting, and the location will be on Skype, and the time will be at 1 p.m. Alright, now after that we will need to do something with these meeting details, so we're going to resolve the promise and we'll pass it our meeting details. And then if has meeting is true, we'll say else. So if there's already a meeting scheduled, we're going to reject the promise and we're going to pass it a new error, and we'll say meeting already scheduled. So if has meeting is false, we'll create the meeting. If not, we'll return our error. So we've created the promise. Now how do we use it? So we'll chain .then and .catch to our promise like this. So we'll call it by saying meeting, that was our promise, and we'll say .then, and we'll pass our result into an arrow function. And so in here we'll have the resolved data, and then after then we can use a .catch, and within here we will have our error, and in here we will have our reject data. So let's do something with this data. So let's just log it. So we'll do a console log, and we'll say meeting scheduled, and then we'll also log the result. And then in our catch we will console log our error message. Alright, so let's save this. There we see meeting scheduled, and we have our object. So again, in the then, we're receiving the response from the resolve, which is our object. And then in the error, we would receive our error message if there was one. So let's go up to has meeting, and let's change that to true. And I'll save that, and now we see meeting already scheduled. So our reject error message is getting passed here in our catch. Now sometimes we may need to execute 2 or more asynchronous operations based on the result of the previous promise. In this case, promises can be chained. So we'll use this example that we have here. I'll change this back to false. And let's create another promise. So after our meeting promise, I'm going to create another constant, and I'll name this add to calendar. And we'll make this equal to an arrow function. We'll pass it meeting details, and then we'll return a new promise, and we need our resolve and our reject. And within this new promise, we'll create a constant called calendar, and we'll just make this equal to a template literal, and we'll say meeting details dot name is scheduled at meeting details dot time on meeting details dot location. So now we have to do something with this variable, so we'll resolve the promise and we'll pass it the variable calendar. This is quite a bit of code, so we could actually rewrite this. We could shorten it. So let me show you the difference here. I'm going to copy this and duplicate it. So there you can see the two. And so what we could actually do is we can remove the promise statement from here. Let's move all of this back. So we'll still have our calendar variable, but instead of doing this resolve calendar here, we can simply say return promise.resolve and pass the calendar variable. So if we're going to go straight to a resolve, we don't actually have to type all of this and create a new promise just to resolve it for one variable. We can just create our variable and then return promise.resolve and pass the variable. So let me get rid of this one. So now we have our meeting promise. We also have our add to calendar promise. So let's look at how we can chain these together. So in order to chain this, we simply have to add another .then. And that's it. So let's run this and see what we get. So now we get meeting schedule. Marketing meeting is scheduled at 1 p.m. on Skype. So we're getting this console log here, and we're getting this console log with res. Now last time res was our object. This time it is what is returned from the previous promise. So in our add to calendar, we're returning this template literal string. So we can keep chaining as many thens as we need to call multiple promises. A lot of times we have multiple promises that we need to run at the same time and then do something once they have all completed. In this case, we can use promise.all. Let's see how that works. So I'm going to create a constant and we'll name it promise1. We'll make this equal to promise.resolve, and we'll just say promise1 complete. And then I'll create another constant and I'll name this promise2, and I'll make this equal to a new promise, and we need to pass in our resolve and reject, and then our arrow function. And within this, we're going to use a set timeout. And we'll set this to 2000 milliseconds, that's 2 seconds. And in here, we're just going to resolve promise to complete. Okay, so first let's see what they do on their own. So let's do promise1.then, and we'll pass it the result and arrow function, and we will just console log the result. And then promise2, the same thing. All right, let's save that and see what happens. Immediately we have promise1 and then promise2 after 2 seconds. So that's exactly what we'd expect. But we want them both to return at the same time. So in that case, we'll use promise.all. So we'll say promise.all, and then in here we'll pass it an array of the promises. So we'll say promise1 and promise2. After that, we'll have a then and our result, and we'll console log the result. Okay, so let's comment these out and let's run this. And watch, after 2 seconds, we get both of the resolved promises in an array. So a quick side note, there is another method that we could use that is promise.race. So I couldn't think of a good example for this, but if for some reason you have multiple promises and all that you care about is the first one that finishes and the rest of them you want to discard, we could change this to promise.race. So this is only going to return the first promise to finish. So immediately we're going to get promise1 complete, and it's not ever going to return promise2. Okay, so just to recap what we have so far, promises still use callbacks, but they are easier to read and write. They provide a way for us to continue our code while it waits for something else. Now, there is a special function that you don't often hear about, and it's called a generator function. So let me show you what that looks like. Okay, so this is what a generator function would look like. So what makes it a generator function is we have this star here, and then we have this keyword yield. So we're getting some data, and we are pausing the function until we receive the data, and then doing something with the data. So generator functions are not about asynchronous operations or event loops. They're just about pausing things. And so with this, you can pause just this one function while the rest of the code around it continues to run. So generators are complex, and we could spend an entire video on them. So I just want you to understand where generators fit into the next subject that we're going to cover, which is async await. And so async await is basically just a thin layer of syntax on top of promises and generators. It can be referred to as syntactic sugar. It just makes writing promises easier and look better. So let's go back to our meeting example. And so what we can do here is we can turn this into an async await function. So in order to do that, we need to wrap our promises in another function. So we're going to add, before this, a function, and we'll name it myMeeting. And what we need to do with this function is we need to define it as async. So we add that to the beginning of the function. Now within the function, instead of calling the meeting and then calling calendar and then doing this and catch this, we're going to actually get rid of all of this, and we're going to create some variables. So we're going to say const meeting details equals await meeting. Okay, so this is going to assign the results of meeting to the constant meeting details. And we added the await in front of our promise. So any code after meeting is not going to execute until meeting has finished. So the next one we'll add is constant message. And this is going to be our calendar message, and we'll say await add to calendar, and we're going to pass it the meeting details. So this promise add to calendar needed meeting details to complete first. So that's why we have the await. And now we're going to await on this one as well. So nothing after this will execute until it's completed. And so what we'll do is we'll just console log the message. And so we'll have to call this function. So we'll say myMeeting and just call the function. So let's see what that does. And we get our marketing meeting is scheduled at 1 p.m. on Skype. We get our message. So you can see how this is much shorter and more concise, easier to read. It makes it look a lot more logical in the order that it's executed. So now you may think, well, what about error handling? Because we took away the catch. So where is the error going to go? So let's go up to the top and let's change this to true. And let's save that. And so now we're getting an uncaught error. We don't want that. So with async await functions, there are a couple of ways that we can go about handling the error. So for a one-off or a unique situation, we could add the error handling when we call the function. So we could use a.catch here and then do our error handling. And then I'll save this. And we have our error now. You most likely are not going to want to do your error handling on each call. So another way to go about this is to put our entire code block here, that any code that could possibly throw an error, we want to wrap it in a try catch. So we'll say try and then catch. And then within the catch, we can console log our error message, and I'll save this, and we'll see that we get the same thing. So now this catch is passing our reject error message to the console. Okay, so that's going to be it for this video. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. If you have any questions about any of this, add a comment below. And if you think this video or any of the videos on my channel might be helpful to someone else, please share them. As always, if you liked this video, a thumbs up is appreciated. I upload new videos every week, so hit subscribe and the bell to get notified. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at CodeStacker. Thanks for watching.